Welcome to the Big Bets on Campus podcast. I'm Mike Calabrese, joined by my Action Network co-hosts Josh Nunn, aka Duck, and Christian Odjakjian. But today is a day where we welcome in another member of this illustrious panel, and you're going to probably recognize his voice right away, or at least you've seen his numbers. It's Evan Miya, who has done just incredible work in the college basketball space. You can't really watch, enjoy, discuss college football, college basketball, any of these sports in modern times without getting into the nitty gritty. And when it comes to the hardwood, Evan Miyakawa is your guy. This is a very special opportunity for us. What we're going to do, Evan, is we're going to pepper you with questions. But before we get into that, how are you feeling at this point in the season? I'm sure you're just as excited as any college basketball fan, but you have to be just being run ragged at this point in the season. Media, updating your model, everything that goes into keeping everything fresh on your site. It seems like every single week you're putting out something new on social media, a new way to discuss the sport, kill shots, avalanches, the list goes on and on. How are you feeling at this point in the year?
I mean, it's a good problem to have if you are overloaded with stuff to do. It just means people are care and are paying attention. And so even though it's the busiest time of year, it's the most fun time of year. So I'm thankful for all of it.
As I mentioned, we have a lot to get into, so I'm just going to kick it to my man Duck to get things started. He has some questions about your model, someone who also, keeps his own model, the fine tuning, the tweaking, not, being moved too much by some statistical outliers. There's so many things to get into, but Duck, please take it away.
Yeah, first off, Evan, thanks for joining us today. Big fan of your work, as are most everybody here that works at Action Network. So we definitely appreciate the time. One of the biggest things that I've had to pivot in my preseason handicapping is trying to really get a fingerprint on what these teams are going to look like from a personnel standpoint, the players that are returning, coming and going, coaching schematic changes, things of that nature. So before your model interacts with a single data point from the current season, how do you go about setting things up in the preseason with so much of that configuration that changes from one year to the next? How do you formulate the baseline for where a team should be entering game one compared to where it was last year at the end of the year? Because that could be two very different things.
I mean, yeah, it's harder than ever to do that well because of all of the roster turnover, transfer portal, and now even with things like we're having more international recruits coming in where we don't have any college data on them. So it's definitely a challenge. I think one of the pros of what I do at evanmiya.com is everything is very much built from the player level up. So I have a very sophisticated algorithm for valuing how important or impactful a player is on offense and defense in any given season over the course of a career. And so it starts with that. It starts with looking at every single player that's going to be on a team's roster. What is their projected value, just kind of agnostic of what team they're playing for in terms of their offense and defense. And it takes into account if they're a returning player, if they're a transfer, if they played multiple years in Division One, how they've performed over those seasons. If they are a younger player, what was their recruiting profile coming out of high school, and what does that tell us about the potential that they have? Or if they're a new player to Division One, I have projections for all freshmen and international recruits that are based on essentially how have people in previous seasons in their first year in college performed based on how they were ranked according to the recruiting services coming into that year, and what's a typical baseline for those types of players. So you get a number for every player, and then that can go up to essentially like there's a roster talent eval for every single team that represents how good their roster is. And that carries a significant part of the weight, and especially for teams with new coaches, that is even more important because we don't have a track record of how good that team is with that coach and that coaching staff. But it also does still look into account what is your program prestige essentially. How has your team performed in previous years? How has your coaching staff helped a team perform above or below expectations in previous years based on how good that roster is? So a lot of those variables go into the final preseason number, but the roster talent evaluation part of it certainly is the most important piece.
So then I have a follow-up question for that real quick. And we have seen teams now that we're getting towards the end of the season, and these teams kind of had a mosaic for what they were going to be. A big outlier for me has been Pepperdine. Ed Schilling had deployed a slower pace, conservative defensive style the first 15 to 18 games. And now you have that completely scrapped and thrown out the window the last 7 or 8 games of the season. So there's got to be some sort of in-season pivot or some micro adjustments that are made by you to account for when teams just scrap the system and start playing a different style. I'd be interested to hear kind of when you pivot or how you make those micro adjustments.
Yeah, ultimately, one of the issues with doing this sort of exercise in predicting team performance before a season starts, even within a season, is you have different like levels or buttons that you can press as a coaching staff to try different things. But ultimately, everyone is still trying to do the same thing, and that is win games and score more points than your opponent. Everyone is still hitting that button as hard as they can. And so whatever they're trying to do to get there, they will do that. And so ultimately what I have found is that there is no real correlation just across Division One in terms of if teams play better across the board if they play faster, or they play better if they play slower, or if they go deeper into their bench versus play starters more. These are stylistic elements that every team has. And you can look at a singular case like Pepperdine and say, hey, they were doing this thing up to this point, and then they changed, and we think that is good, or we think that is bad. But ultimately, that's just one data point out of 365 teams. And ultimately, every single game, a coaching staff is trying to do something stylistically that will lead to them winning. So all that to say is, I don't have anything that looks at, oh, Pepperdine made this change in the season, and just because of this stylistic change, I'm going to adjust my evaluation on them. It's ultimately, okay, is that leading to better in-game performance or worse in-game performance in terms of your offensive and defensive efficiency? Because it's not a given either way. And so that's really more the most important element that it comes down to, if that makes sense.
Hey, Evan, my first question is, as someone who's never made a model and I don't understand all of the elements that go into creating one, how often are you tinkering with it? And like, since you've started, what has kind of been the progression of that? Can you even tinker with it like at this point in the season?
Great question. I'm always making adjustments in the off season. So if there's something that's a new element to the model I want to add, or something that I've noticed during a season that I'm not sure if it's quite right, I will examine it during the off season, and maybe it reaffirms that it was right, or maybe there's some sort of small like tweak I need to make. Additionally, I often will update the model, keep the model the same, but update it with more training data, essentially, which is just, okay, adding in the results from the previous season that can help make the model more accurate predicting future seasons, because as we know, the trends in college basketball are changing every single year. And so something that might be right a season ago may be a little bit off this season. So that always is a process that I do it every single off season. Within a given season, I really try and avoid tinkering with anything unless something's clearly broken. Just because, number one, people notice if something changes, and especially if you have a coach and they're like, hey, my team was ranked 90th yesterday and now we're 96th and we haven't played a game. What happened? That doesn't look good. But also, generally speaking, I don't it's very easy to often overreact to something that's happening during a season and saying, oh, it's not capturing this one thing right, I need to just sort of manually adjust this thing. And typically that's too much of a knee-jerk reaction, and it will actually come back towards what you expect, because we have years and years of data of what college basketball looks like. And, a couple weeks into a new season, maybe there are some things that are different, but it can often be a little bit of often kind of regression to the mean in terms of overall trends, if that makes sense. So I'm not typically changing anything significant during this season.
Sure.
To piggyback on Christian's question there, we talk about it all the time on this podcast, which is KYP, know your personnel. How much does a single player, a starter, a leading scorer, a shot blocker being on the bench due to injury or suspension impact a team? Kind of that broader question. If you remove one plank and replace it in a ship, it's still the same ship. But eventually there's a tipping point where they're not the same team. How do you, before you even get into the math, how do you just conceptualize that, both in terms of your model and then also when you're having conversations like this with members of the media? How do you go ahead and present that in a way that feels even-handed?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the areas where my player evaluations really provide a lot of value. Is essentially it gives you a math equation of, okay, I can say exactly how good this team should be if you have a full roster versus if you take a single player away or multiple players away. And that's actually something that's incorporated in all of my game predictions, is relatively adjusted injury reports that are taking into account players that are out for the season or out for a significant period of time. And we'll basically say like, hey, this is how good a team should be if they're healthy. And if you take this player away or multiple players away in some cases, this is how the team strength changes. And that's all baked into the game predictions there, which is a really nice feature. And I think it comes down to a couple things. Number one, what is the general quality of the player that is out, right? Just like what is their, how do they compare numerically compared to all other Division One players? But equally important is who will be taking their minutes if they're not there. Because you could take the same player away from, a same strength player away from, say, a Pepperdine versus a Gonzaga, and that's going to mean a very different thing based on how good that team is going to perform. So when we look at recent cases of this, some of the most notable examples are, like, for example, Duke was missing Patrick Ngongba for a couple games with a wrist injury, and I have him rated as one of the top 10 most valuable players in the country. However, Duke has such a good team that when he was out, that was only worth about a 2-point adjustment for Duke's overall prediction in terms of the line in a given game. Whereas BYU has Richie Saunders out for the season. Saunders actually rates as a slightly worse player than Ngongba. Pretty similar, but slightly worse. But because of how bad the depth on BYU is, that adjustment for BYU is worth more like 5 or 6 points of him missing because of how much of a gap between him and the players who would take his minutes would be. And you can actually see on my website, I have an indispensability ranking, which ranks essentially who are the players most indispensable to their teams, or in another way of saying, what's the gap between if they have the player versus don't have the player. And that's not necessarily the same as just ranking the best players in college basketball. Like, for example, Cameron Boozer is the most indispensable player in the country, not surprising, but the top next players are Jeremy Fears at Michigan State, Bruce Thornton at Ohio State, Braden Smith at Purdue, Bennett Sturts at Iowa, and now Christian Anderson at Texas Tech. All of those guys are basically saying there is a massive, massive gap between if they're on the team or not on the team. And so I find that very interesting to look at.
One question to kind of put this in a slightly different direction. When you think about your model, evanmiya.com, as in its entirety, the website, the offerings that it's bringing to the table, do you take more pride in going back and looking at previous seasons and perfectly quantifying how good teams are era to era, year to year? Or do you care more deeply about the potential for it to correctly predict the future? And obviously, we're all in that game. We want to be able to, get as many games correctly as possible, and at times stick our neck out and, show that we have some inside information that someone else doesn't have. But at the end of the day, it can be fickle to kind of chase that high because it's still a sport played by teenagers for the most part. You have incredible swings from home courts to away to neutral floors to the impact of, the whistle from the referees. Like, there's so many human elements that can kind of slip through the digital cracks in those spreadsheets. So where do you come down? Do you care more about being able to log everything and have it be, apples to apples year over year? Or as time has gone on, do you take more pride in predicting what's going to happen in the future?
I feel like there is something always satisfying when the way that you portray a previous season in terms of players or teams looks like what it should look like. But ultimately, that's a very subjective, like, kind of back sort of aligning what you think should happen with your own data points. And that doesn't really serve much of a purpose. So to me, even though it is very difficult to predict the future, that is where I ultimately kind of trained everything that I do, is what leads to the best future predictions. Be that best predictions of how good a team is going to be going forward, how good a player is going to be going forward, how good certain individual game predictions are going to be going forward. Ultimately, there are so many different data points, you're never going to get them all right. But the goal for me in kind of my mind is I want to be right a little bit more often than I'm wrong. And the other thing too is the more mainstream evanmiya.com becomes, the less of an edge, quote unquote, that you have because more people are using it. And so that's okay. But in general, I'm always trying to optimize what I'm doing based on predicting the future, unobserved outcomes. That's ultimately the bread and butter of what I'm doing, and that's kind of how I sell it to whether it's fans who are using it or coaches and teams who are using it, of saying like, hey, everything that I have here, when you look at it, this isn't just saying like I'm measuring how good a team or a player or a lineup's been so far. I'm actually trying to give you intel on what's likely to be the best going forward, and that really ultimately leads to more decision-making power, which is, at the end of the day, what I really care about.
Evan, let's talk about a team-specific question. It's kind of been the elephant in the room. It's Miami of Ohio. They're undefeated. They're breezing through MAC play. It's really a team that seems as though offensively the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. They've got 6 or 7 guys that can really score the basketball. They share it well. But it just seems as though, whether it's the media or ratings personnel, that Miami has this sort of artificial ceiling that's predefined based on the fact that they play in the MAC and nobody would schedule them in the non-conference. How do you handle a team like Miami of Ohio who has won a ton of games? They're very talented. It's not a team reliant on one player or two players, and they're very good. So talk about them real quick, if you would.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting conversation because there is a, relatively speaking, a massive gap between how good their resume looks and how good they actually evaluate as a team in terms of predicting the future. The way I would sort of explain this is if you took a couple of their games that they've had this season, they are 5-0 in games that are one possession games. So if you flipped a couple buckets in 2 to 3 of those, and you gave them a couple more buckets in a few other games that they already won, they would still evaluate as the exact same strength team, but they would have maybe 3 losses, and this wouldn't be a conversation. So in that sense, they are ultimately comes down to winning. They are very deserving to be in the at-large conversation right now, because even though their strength of schedule has been so weak, it still takes a lot to win all of those games against their schedule, and it's more likely than not that an average bubble team would not have won all those games, even against how poor of competition they played in some cases. A lot of these games were on the road, and road games still are tough. But equally, if they were to play on a neutral court against Ohio State tomorrow, my matchup prediction would have them as like 5-point underdogs, which would be a pretty significant line for teams you would typically have that are evenly matched in, say, Dayton in the tournament, for example. So I think about both those things are true. They deserve to get in because even against the lack of high quality opponents that they have, it's still very impressive they've won all those games. And equally, there would be one of the weaker, quote unquote, 9s, 10s, or 11s that we've seen in a while in terms of at-large chances. But a lot of people think that they've sort of cheated the system by scheduling weekly. The reality is that even based on how good of a team we knew they had coming into the year, the chance of them winning all of these games is 1 out of like 1,200. As in, if they were to do this 1,000 times over, this would be the only time that they would be undefeated right now. This is not a cheat code that other teams can copy to fluke their way into the tournament. They were not expecting this to happen. They should have 3 or 4 or 5 losses at this point. So it's not repeatable, and that's why it's awesome, because it's so unexpected.
I'll put you on the spot, and I promise not to clip this. If they go undefeated and hit the auto bid from the MAC, where would you seed them if you had your say?
Right now, I would have them resume-wise as a 9 seed. And I think if they run the table, that's probably where I would put them in terms of what I predict them to have. I have heard some people argue for them being, more in the 6 to 8 range, which I would love. That would be great. But I think a 9 seed would be comfortably in the field, an 8-9 game, like that would be great. And so that would be my best guess right now. If they were undefeated on Selection Sunday, I think that's where they would be.
Christian, let's get you back into the fold here.
Well, the irony here is like, wouldn't they be better off with an 11 at that point? Like if they can't get past the 8, it reminds me of like when FAU got that 9, or even, I don't know, that just frustrates me in a way.
Well, I think that we need to start with, let's just get them 1 win in the tournament. Getting to the Sweet 16 is not a guarantee.
That's
so true. I'll take whatever I can take to get them an easier first round opponent. We'll do that.
It kind of reminds me of that. It's not apples to apples, of course, but that Providence team 3 years ago that kept winning and was like in like the 30s in KenPom when they were like pushing the top 10 in the AP poll. I understand that the reason why the predictive metrics will be lower on these teams that are winning all these close games is because it's a predictive metric. It's not about ranking what they've done, but is there any like secret sauce that could ever be determined where you are giving credit to a team's ability to have things go their way in that game because they are a good team and because they are well coached and have good chemistry? Or is it like an outlier thing where maybe Jerome Tang is not a good coach, but he just happens to keep winning these overtime games, so that would be a mistake if you were to give them the benefit of the doubt for that trend?
Yeah, I do think that is potentially a weakness in all of these efficiency-based team metrics, which is how I do my entire site, is how KenPom works. And I think there can be said something for, are you really accounting for that winning factor? I think by and large, it does a good job of kind of finding signal over the noise and saying like, if you are 5-0 in one possession games, that's likely to not go in your favor as often in the future. And maybe it's more likely you would go 3-2 in those games instead of 5-0. But the reality is winning by 1 point versus losing by 1 point does very little to move your overall team strength in terms of these predictive efficiency ratings. But in terms of what people actually care about, that actually feels significant. People really care about a team's ability to win close games. So I haven't done a extensive study on this, but if there was something that I was able to kind of add to my model in the future that better accounted for that, that's something I've certainly considered. And could be something that's a little bit missing, generally speaking, from this type of models that we often use.
Now, Evan, on your website it says you work with over 120 Division I programs. How much of these schools bring their specific needs to you, and that impacts what you're delivering? I know in recent years you've created this robust portal dashboard, for lack of a better phrase, so that both fans and schools can come in, see who's entered the portal, where they would stack up versus everyone else. Working with so many programs, has that impacted the kind of products that you're bringing to market?
It certainly does impact that a lot. And ultimately, I have a lot of different types of consumers of my site, fans, media, coaches. I think the group I care the most about targeting or streamlining stuff for is coaches, because they're the ones who have the most decision-making power in all of this. But the reality is that the same stuff coaches can use is also enjoyable for people who are just diehard college basketball fans and that sort of thing. So the way I typically structure my site is I don't do a lot of ad hoc consulting work where I'm doing a specific project that's siloed to one team and it's not being shared with anyone else. Typically, if someone brings an idea to me, my immediate idea is how can I actually automate this and then make this available to everybody? So for example, the big product that I launched last year, which has been a big hit, is a very team specific tool for coaches and GMs called the Front Office Suite, which is basically a roster building tool that I have that builds on my portal stuff that actually helps identify how much players should be worth in terms of dollar amounts to teams. And this came from a lot of coaches being like, hey, do you have numbers that I could also attach to this in terms of dollar amounts? And the reality was I could probably cook something up for that one team, but I would actually rather build it so that it can be reproducible in the future. And so that's what led to building this tool. And now any team who wants to use it can use it. So in that sense, a lot of what I do is kind of driven by feedback I'm getting from coaches. And at the end of the day, I'm always trying to then funnel that to how can I automate this so that it's widely available to everybody instead of me having to manually put something together for each custom project or client, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. Christian, you were actually wondering about that automated elements of it. What specifically did you want to know from Evan, behind the scenes and those interactions with programs and coaches?
Well, I was also just curious, if AI has impacted your process at all, or if you think there's another frontier of data to be collected with AI.
In terms of, I divide the AI conversation into two categories, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but one is AI tools that help you do what you're already doing, which I use that a lot. I have used AI to help streamline my own workflows of what I'm doing. But the second, which is the more important one in this conversation, is handing the keys to AI to do stuff that you're not currently doing, or to find new discoveries that maybe you don't have the time to do on your own. And in that sense, in terms of baking AI into stuff on my website, in terms of it doing certain functionality, I feel compared to the regular sort of tech world, sports analytics and coaches are very, very slow to adopt that. And I think for probably good reason of, a coach is not going to trust an AI chatbot to recommend players to them in the portal based on data, right? Even if there is some validity to that, there is so much nuance that goes into it that even if they maybe should trust AI, they just won't. They want to talk to a human. They want to interact with someone who can bounce ideas off of them in a, more human way, I guess. So I feel the coaches that I would often work with would probably be pretty slow to adopt sort of stuff like that. And so for that reason, I don't predict that we're going to see a lot of AI tools. They're going to quickly kind of redefine college basketball, at least in terms of big decisions that are being made coaching wise, roster wise, things like that.
Evan, the last question I have for you, this is a college football betting podcast, and oftentimes we go through deep dives of matchups using analytics, using things that you can quantify in the spreadsheets. But there are other mitigating factors that are hard to quantify, and sometimes the eyeball test takes over. So let's just say, maybe not a bet, but let's say you're going to make a declaration about a team or a matchup. Are there ever times where you may override the model and possibly trust it less in favor of the eyeball test or some other situational factors that can be hard to quantify in the metric sheet?
Yeah, certainly. I think my general stance on eyeball versus data is that your most informed, accurate opinion or knowledge, if you will, is when you combine those two things together. You take the objective data tools like what I have and you can find on other sites and things like that, and you combine it with your own expert knowledge of the field, your eyeball test, if you want to call it that. And whether that's from a coach's perspective or a fan's perspective or a bettor's perspective, marrying the two gets you to the most informed, accurate place. And I don't think you should blindly trust the data and throw out your eye test. I also think you shouldn't just throw out all the data because you disagree with one data point and therefore say it's all useless and only go with your eye test. I think you should combine them both. For me, because so much of what I do, I understand very intimately all the data that I have, and everything is ultimately built in a way that I think I want to align with the eye test or the expert knowledge of the field, if you will. That's why I watch so many college basketball games. I don't just let these numbers crunch on their own and I don't actually pay attention. I want it to be driven by my own kind of insights and discovery of what's going on in college basketball. So I agree, quote unquote, or trust probably 90 to 95% of the stuff that I see. I take it at face value and I say that's probably right. There are exceptions, though, where it's like, oh, I'm watching this team play, and though they're ranked sixth, I mean, like an example would be right now, like Houston, I have ranked as the fifth best team in the country, but they haven't felt like the fifth best team in the country the last several games when I've watched them, and they seem like they have bigger holes than that. Ultimately, does that mean I'm slotting them down to 15th in my mind because that's how good they looked? No, but it probably will give me a little bit of slightly more hesitation about maybe picking them to go further in my bracket than if I hadn't had that experience of watching them. So I typically don't like journey that far from where the data says, but I am willing to kind of tweak it a little bit in my mind based on what I've actually experienced from watching, if that makes sense.
Really does make sense. I mean, I've said it for years that sports betting, particularly at the collegiate level, there is an art to it, and there is an element of the gut or what you see with your eyes. So it's reassuring to hear you say that at times that can be just as important in marrying those two together. So I really appreciate you walking through that.
Just from a visual standpoint, I love when you throw in the emojis on teams where it's like the head bandage, they're dealing with injuries, they're in the freezer. I'm going to throw one extra one in there because Houston, I'm very interested in. I followed every one of their games this year. I have a 17-1 ticket for them to win it. I would throw a brick wall emoji next to them because as Kingston Flemings hit that freshman wall, because the last couple of games, his shot selection, his confidence, it just he's gone from a guy who's dropped 40 plus in a game where it looked like he was an NBA All-Star to being a little bit overwhelmed. But it shouldn't come as a shock just because these guys have such high ceilings. They're still 18-year-olds, and this used to be a common conversation piece in college football and college basketball that freshmen, you're going to have those freshman nights. So is that what you think's going on with Houston, just from a personnel standpoint beyond just the numbers?
Yeah, I think so. I think probably it's a bit exaggerated, and I think it's the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But I think this is part of why I have preseason projections on my site that still carry weight all the way to the very end of the season. So, for example, if you go to KenPom right now, I don't think there's any preseason bias, if you want to call that, baked into the team ratings at this point. Nor should there be, from a sense of like fairly evaluating teams' resumes and it's being used on the team sheets by the committee. On my website, it is still a factor. It's a small factor, but there is still an element of what were the expectations for this player, this team in the preseason that still does matter, because oftentimes teams kind of revert to preseason expectation in terms of their overall roster talent, in terms of expectations for certain players. So there was a point earlier in this season when I think I had Kingston Flemings based on, again, he was not supposed to be a top 5 freshman in the sport. He was very far outside of that range. And more extreme example would be Keaton Wagler. I had Kingston Flemings as being a much worse player in the preseason than he's turned out to be. But when we got to late December and it was like, this kid's lighting the world on fire, I probably only had him rated as a top 20 or 25 player in the sport. And it's purely because it's typically very unlikely that a player ranked where he was ranked out of high school is able to sustain the level of performance the entire season that we had seen from him up to that point Well, guess what? That's kind of what's happening now. He's faltering a little bit. And again, that's just one data point, but that's an example of how kind of grounding in reality and not getting over exaggerating or overreacting to a certain player's performance or a team's performance, you can kind of get carried away with it. And now I would argue the opposite side of like Kingston Flemings is a better player than what we've seen the last 4 to 5 games. This is not the truth for him going forward. The truth is often somewhere in the middle.
So I understand how injuries can be impacted into the model, but something that I always think is interesting and an edge I try to find is just how teams play different or a different, like using the rotation differently. Like an example from last night, my guy T.O. Barrett for Mizzou went for 28. He was playing he was averaging 4 points a game coming off the bench. Like they lost to Ole Miss. He played 8 minutes. Like they beat Florida and he only played 8 minutes. So that's something like if they were to meet again in the SEC tournament, that's a storyline I'm looking at. Manny Obaseki on A&M, that was the same thing. He became a different player. Is there any way that is impacted, or is that something that I'm smart for trying to figure out on my own because the models aren't figuring those things out?
I think that's one of those cases where there can be a few specific examples each season where that you can identify that and can work in your favor, but it's very hard to system-wide identify that across maybe 200 or 500 cases, and for it to be very accurate each time. So I think that is one of those cases where, going back to the whole eye test thing, it's probably sticking out to you because you're identifying it already by the fact you're watching that game closely or watching that team closely, and you understand more exactly how they work on a game-to-game basis. And so that's an example where you maybe have a little bit of an edge over a computer, quote unquote, because you're able to see that sort of thing.
And then I have to ask you this. How has your quest for making the best model possible impacted your experience as a basketball consumer? Because I can tell by the way you tweet and the way you talk that you really understand the game and you watch, but how do you prevent yourself from becoming a total, you know what I'm saying, keeping that that boy nice part of yourself, in the mix?
Sure. I really, really try hard to not cheer for results that would prove me right. I really, really try hard, because the reality is I'm not just a media pontificator who puts out articles in the preseason or is a talking head and makes certain predictions. And there's, 10 to 15 of them I really care about. You can literally look at every single team and every single player and see exactly what I think about all of them. And a lot of them are going to be right, and a slightly less percentage of them will be wrong. And it is impossible for me to get them all right. So it takes the joy away from college basketball if I'm cheering for things to be exactly as I'm expecting or predicting them to be. And that would certainly it makes sense in March Madness, right? If I'm predicting that the 4-1 seeds are the best teams in the tournament, it would be dumb if I'm cheering for those 4-1 seeds to make the Final Four, because that's less fun, right? So even though that's what I'm predicting, I don't care if that happens, because I trust the body of work that I'm doing, and it's going to be right more often than it's wrong, and I'll let it do its thing. And I will still enjoy the randomness and unpredictableness of college basketball. And if I end up being super wrong on a team, great. If I picked a team to be bad in the preseason and they're awesome, I don't want to be mad about that. I want to cheer for them. This is great. So I really do try and fight against that.
All right, us three talking heads here on the Big Bets on Campus podcast. I have a lightning round for you before you get out of here. First question, if you had the power, would you expand the NCAA tournament, or would you have a constitutional amendment to keep it at 68 teams moving forward?
No, please, no expansion. Come on.
Right.
I don't see any real argument for it bringing more majors into the tournament. We've not seen that be practiced by the committee in the past. And additionally, I was at the mock selection committee exercise on Thursday, and it's every year we look at the bubble and these teams stink. We don't need more stinky teams. So keep it the same size.
How did you come up with the kill shot / avalanche moniker? What was the influence that went into that?
I think it started back in 2021 maybe, and I was watching one of those Illinois teams with Io DeSumo, and I think this was the year before they were really good, and they were a team that just felt man, they go on big scoring runs, they give up momentum quickly, and I was okay, is there a way I can actually quantify this? And that's what led to saying, if I just measure every time a team goes on a 10-0 run, how does that actually present across the whole season, and is there actually value in finding that? So this was an example of a metric that came from me just watching and feeling the momentum shift in a game and being like, this is something that we experience as fans. Is there a way I can actually measure this and compare this and validate what we're feeling? And so that's kind of how it started, was just sort of, watching games, having the experience, and then saying, can I actually measure this? So
Top seed right now, forget about what the AP poll says. That, the top 8, 10, 12, whatever teams you want to pick from are headed towards the tournament with incredible resumes, great personnel, coaching acumen, yada, yada, yada. One of them has to give you pause where they are right now in the season, that maybe they're not such a lock for the second weekend as everyone else thinks. Which team rises to the surface for you in that regard?
So we're talking about teams that would be on the 1, 2, 3 seed lines, that sort of thing?
Correct.
Let me think about this. I feel like the team that I have the most concern over relative to maybe where I feel like public perception is on them, or at least how the fans of their own team feel, is maybe UConn. UConn is right now slated to be on the 1 seed line. I have them as just the 8th best team in the tournament, or in the nation. And additionally, a trend with them is they play great in big games, but they don't play as well in games against bad teams. So I think they could be slightly more upset prone, and they've shown lapses of concentration at times in games like that. So I would be a little bit more worried about them maybe than some of these other teams, that they would slip up and not make it to the Sweet 16.
Now, let's have some more fun. On the other side of the spectrum, beyond the top teams that could underperform, you want to get into the Cinderellas that could punch above their weight. What's a team, and I know you don't root, you're rooting for them secretly to win their low major league in their conference tournament, punch their ticket, because you think they have a really good chance to win a game in the round of 64?
I feel like I would go with, there aren't really a lot of teams that stick out to me right now from low major conferences that I feel very confident in their ability to win. I feel like maybe a team that I want to get over the hump, certainly because they've been there and they haven't had the cards haven't been played right by them in the past, but it's Liberty. I love Liberty. I love Richie McKay. And I have cheered for them in many a previous tournament when they have been on that 12 line or something like that, and they are on a incredible run in conference play this year. And so I think it would be great if they could get in. A maybe more often or likely team would also be a Belmont, a very good team, a team that also plays really well in their best games this season. So I'm looking at Belmont and Liberty as my 2 picks there.
Our producer David won't let you off the hook unless you provide us your national title game and your champion, who ends up cutting down the nets this year.
Chalky right now because we don't have the bracket, but I'm taking Michigan and Duke. I think they're a cut above everyone else. And if they were to play again on a neutral, I still think Michigan would be the slightly better team. So I'm picking Michigan.
Evan, thank you so much for joining the program. We wouldn't be able to do our work without you doing your work. We're just standing on the shoulders of giants, just 3 talking heads here, just trying to pick some winners in the college basketball space. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be following all your content very closely. As soon as those graphs come out and there's the X and Y axis and which teams can go to the Final Four, I immediately perk up. So I love everything that you're doing. Thanks again for dropping by.
I appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Don't miss out on any of our best bets by signing up for Action Pro. Action Pro users get real-time alerts as soon as experts like myself, Stuckey, Duck, Christian, any of us tracking anything in the app, you're going to be first to know. You also get real-time money percentages to see where the smart money is flowing, and access to our player projections powered by Sean Kerner and his predictive analytics team. Dr. Nick also dropping off his college basketball player props, which become invaluable during March Madness. It's just been an absolute printing press. So you want to be able to get his picks as soon as they hit the market, because he is a market mover. Right now, you can get $20 off an annual subscription of Action Pro. Just go to actionnetwork.com/pro and use promo code POD20 to get started. That's promo code POD20 for $20 off at actionnetwork.com/pro. All right, it's been a fun episode thus far, cutting up with Evan Miya, but the main reason that most of you guys are here is to hear some of our best bets from the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday card. We're going to go rapid fire around the horn. Duck, get us started. I'm sure this is a nationally ranked game. Just kidding. Chicago State, Long Island. Talk to me about the total.
Yeah, projected totals 143.5. Long Island does have the best defense in the Northeastern Conference, and they really do well to limit success behind the three-point line. The Sharks have the best three-point defense in the conference, and they're actually pretty decent at protecting the rim. Long Island does block or alter more shots than anybody else in this league. Both of these offenses are really bad at getting to the foul line, so there's going to be nothing cheap at the rim, not as many freebies from the charity stripe. Chicago State had a real spirited effort in their home finale last week against Central Connecticut, but I could see these guys throwing up a real stinker here. In the first meeting, State scored just 55 points, but they had 36 at the under 10 timestamp of the second half. And this first matchup just never trended to surpass the posted total of that game or this one. Long Island is going to match the pace here, which should be very slow. And I just feel like it's going to be a real problem for Chicago State. They're going to try to move the ball into the painted area. They're not going to shoot a lot of threes. I just don't see a lot of success here. They are the fourth worst 2-point shooting team in the entire country is Chicago State. I want the under in this matchup.
Christian, you're going top of the card, Purdue, Michigan State. I kind of like Sparty, depending on the number I'm getting here, but you're actually targeting the total.
Yeah, I'll put my duck pants on here and take an under. This is it's great to have Evan on, and I'm all for data-backed picks. Sometimes got to go with the vibes, and Michigan State Purdue games have been gross in half court and gritty. The last season it was 75-66. They played a game in the 60s in the Big Ten tournament. The year before, I just don't trust Michigan State to score effectively really in any of these matchups. I understand Wisconsin just dropped 90 on them when they had them at home, so Purdue could obviously cook offensively and do their thing, but just with the way Michigan State's bigs can guard in the post, I think it'll be difficult. Osterkloff hasn't been much of anything lately, neither has Jacobson, so stylistically it will be interesting to see if Michigan State tries to get the ball out of TKR's hands or let him try to score one-on-one against Cooper and Kohler. Nonetheless, very familiar opponents. I expect a half-court gritty game. Take the under.
On Thursday, I'm heading to the Summit, North Dakota State at St. Thomas. The Tommies laying 2.5 or 3. The Bison and Tommies are 117th and 118th, respectively, in KenPom. The winner here, if they go on a run and win out and obviously cut down the nets as the Summit Conference Tournament champion, there's a chance they could grab a 13 seed. And there's a big difference this year in overall quality in terms of the opponent you're going to draw if you're 14 or 13. So bracket positioning matters. Now, round one in Fargo, the Tommies led at half. It was tied with under 9 minutes to go. Nick Janowitz missed a long-range three-pointer at the buzzer that would have sent it to overtime. So that first meeting demonstrated why David Richmond's team for NDSU is so hard to kill. They get so many second-chance buckets. They're gobbling up 15 rebounds in that first game, and it's the reason why they're ninth nationally in extra scoring opportunities, which essentially is the margin of offensive rebounds and forced turnovers vis-a-vis what you give away to the opponent. They're plus 5.7 per game. So why step in front of this NDSU train? It's all about shooting. The Tommies are first nationally in 2-point percentage, ninth in shooting efficiency. They don't turn the ball over, fewer than 10 giveaways per game. And John Tower, their coach, he's a fascinating guy. If you don't know anything about this guy, he has been there forever. He's also, has a degree in psychology, in sports performance. So he really does a lot between the ears for his players to get them to believe that they're even better than they are. And he's done a lot with this program. This is the only program to jump from D3 to D1. They had that weird situation where their D3 conference was like, you guys are winning too much. Get the hell out of here. So they had nowhere to go but all the way up to D1, and they pulled it off. This could be a potential for a fourth straight year improving in their overall wins. This is also a program under Tower that won the national championship at the D3 level. I think they're right on the cusp of becoming a special team. And when you look at their two wins, Nolan Minasale, Nick Janowitz, they're microwaves. They've both had multiple 30-point games this year. On their home floor, by the way, the Lee and Penny Anderson Arena, it's a $183 million facility. The very first year it's been opened here. It's the best in low major basketball and overall quality. This place is going to be sold out. This place is going to be a zoo. I think there's a real opportunity to grab them. Anything below, let's call it 3.5, I think a play is on the Tommies here. All right, Duck, back to you. Let's talk about another play that you have on Friday, a team that we just, waxed poetic about. So difficult to quantify. Where is Miami of Ohio? Are we talking total or are we talking side here?
Well, the Spread Hawks have been covering at an alarming rate, and their games had been going over. I didn't think their last game against Eastern Michigan was going to go over. I actually wrote up the under on that one, and they did have a bad shooting night against Eastern Michigan. Miami of Ohio shot just 5 out of 28 from deep and 68% from the foul line. They eked out a road cover against EMU on the road. And Ipsy is a place that they have struggled over the past couple of years. Now they go back on the road and they play against the worst defense in the MAC in Western Michigan. This Western Michigan defense, they cannot guard shooters. They can't defend the lane. And they do not defend well without fouling. What does this mean? Antoine Wolfhook and Brant Byers are going to have their way with Western Michigan in the lane. They should procure a ton of trips to the foul line in this game. Shooters are going to be open, and I fully expect Miami to be focused here. In the first matchup, they shot very poorly from three-point range, just 6 out of 26, and they still scored 87 points. I look at Miami's defense. They did lock down Eastern Michigan, but Western has a much better offense and will match the blazing pace that Miami of Ohio wants to play with here. Miami should approach 90 points or more in this one. I think we could see 75 to 80 from Western Michigan. This one's going to eke over with late game fouling with a projected total of 163. I want to go on the high side here.
Christian, you're looking at another Big Ten matchup on Friday night, Illinois against Michigan. The Illini scored a goddamn avalanche against UCLA, 20-0 run, and they couldn't win that game. The amount of shit I caught online, rightfully so. I was all fading Mick and just people sending me little emojis of, oh, it's a square pick. Yeah, when I'm up by 23 points, I'm a loser for picking the Illini there. I can't touch this game. I'm too clearly too emotionally invested in the ups and downs of the Fighting Illini and Brad Underwood at this point. But you're going in with them against Michigan. Tell me why you think it's the right time to buy.
Well, Mike, I was going to message you when it was 33-10 and say, what a call on the alt line. Maybe I could have undid the jinx that the other people were giving you if I said that. But Michigan has been tough for me to read. I kind of stopped betting Michigan games like in November once they started just beating people by 40. I was just kind of a little confused after. I mean, it was honestly, no, the Penn State game where after you're beating everyone by 40, you go and play Penn State, one of the bottom teams of the Big Ten, and you only win by 2. And then there's just, I don't know if I've been able to identify what the issue I have with Michigan is, but I think it's just that you played a good team like Duke, and Duke just looked like a much more cohesive, well-coached team in that, environment where you can't just bully everyone. You can't just in Northwestern say, okay, we're going to start trying now and get a dunk every possession and like lock them up. So if you told me that Michigan played Minnesota at home in a game, they were 23-point favorites where I decided to lay 23 for the first time, I laid a big spread with Michigan and they only won by 10. And this is in a game where they hit 14 threes, shooting 42% from deep and out-rebounded Minnesota by 15. So what was the problem? Minnesota took care of the basketball and they only had 8 turnovers. And they basically played 6 guys, but it was mainly the whole starting 5, but they just took care of the ball, executing the offense and created some looks from deep. Tyson took 10 threes, Durkin took 10 threes, guys with some size that can shoot it. Guess what Illinois has better than literally anyone in the country, better than the Wisconsin team that went splash city against Michigan. They've got bigs who can shoot it and space it out. I think Illinois can execute them in the half court, crash the offensive glass and battle there. Maybe Michigan keeps them off the offensive glass, which is a problem, but I trust Illinois' ability to keep Michigan out of transition, and I don't trust this Michigan team when they're not in transition. So I think Illinois wins this outright at home.
All right, I am going to go to the mainlands, talking about my Rainbow Warriors traveling to the continental U.S. This is a know your postseason bracket kind of game because the Big West, you got to be a top 2 seed. The top 2 get a bye all the way to the semifinals. So being first or second is crucial, and Hawaii is currently in a 3-way tie, with 4 games to play. So there's not a lot of room for error. I know I'm going to get premium effort from them here. And the Bows have been okay on the road. I mean, generally the story, whether it's football or basketball or really any sport, is that long plane ride throws them off. They're 4-5, both straight up and against the spread. So for as much as been made about the travel, I think they've handled fairly well. They get the best 3-point defense in the Big West, 36th overall in Ken Pom adjusted defensive efficiency. Johnson, Ruli Adef, Nami Shah, they have great size. We've talked about it a lot throughout the season. It's reflected in all their rebounding numbers. But I think Johnson is the key here. This is a buy low spot for a game that I think should probably close as a pick'em or maybe Hawaii -1. He has 20-10 upside, but he also has 7 single-digit scoring performances this year, and he's coming off an over 5 night against UC Santa Barbara, a game that they still won. Now, he played poorly against UC Davis at home, scored a season-low 4 points, but his guards bailed him out. They shot 44% from 3 in that game. They get over the hump against the Aggies. I think if we get the best version of Johnson in this game, this is a runaway, but I don't necessarily need, and in a lot of cases, this is what's tied to a low major play. It's 1 player or 2 players. I don't need that. Hawaii plays great team basketball. I do think it will be a runaway and a sweat-free cover if Johnson plays up to his potential, but I still got Bullock to spur the offense from the perimeter, so I'm going to go with the Bows there. All right, Duck, close us out here for your card on Saturday. Yuck. You're going with an Air Force game? Oh my God. We're moving our way up from low major to mid major, but what does this team have, like 3 or 4 wins the whole season?
Money spends the same whether you bet on this game or Duke against
That's true.
UNC.
That's
So
true. Money's green.
Air Force goes to Wyoming. Projected totals 142. We're going high side. Air Force has just completely quit playing any defense. We just saw it again on Tuesday night against San Jose State, 86 to 80. That game went over with 7 minutes to go in the second half. 11 straight games that Air Force has surrendered at least 79 points to their opponent. And I think we will see Wyoming score a ton of points here. Wyoming scored 92 in its last home game against Fresno State. And the Pokes were very much more aggressive on the offensive end. Matija Bellick and Gavin Gores have been out of the fold for a while now for Wyoming, so the Cowboys are going to a smaller, quicker lineup, which should necessitate more possessions and more open looks from deep. Air Force just saw a team do this in San Jose State, and the Flyboys were able to get into the painted area and the foul line. Air Force shot 21 out of 35 from two and 14 out of 22 from the stripe. I think we will see Air Force be able to do that, and they did procure paint touches in the first meeting against Wyoming, where they made 21 out of 32 shots from in close, and they had 20 foul attempts. The Flyboy defense could not keep Wyoming off the charity stripe, and this is going to be high scoring. You're going to want the over in this one.
All right, let's close things out, Christian, with a play out of the A10 for you. Bust out the Cuban cigars. Castro is back for George Washington. You think that's going to be enough for them to hand Dayton a loss after the Flyers just secured the best win in the entire A10 season, handling St. Louis? St. Louis did not get off the bus. They got absolutely whooped in that game. The Billikens, at this point, in a bit of free fall, losing to Rhode Island and Dayton. But where are you in terms of Dayton, maybe being in an emotional spot, or is this all Castro related? Because George Washington, what are they, the Revolutionaries? I can't remember their name change. They've played so much better with him on the floor. He's what, almost 7 feet tall. He can be a double machine, and from a defensive perspective, he has 3.5 stocks per game. So he's someone that you have to keep an eye on and really move your offense around and factor him in every half court possession.
Yeah, they were 2-4 in those games that he missed, so huge to have him back. Totally aligned with you on the emotional spot for Dayton, but really the key to me is not only Castro, but Luke Hunger. You have two power conference bigs that came back down to George Washington, and the problem for St. Louis is, as amazing as Robbie is as an offensive player and positionally sound he can be defensively, Letang, I'm sorry if I'm saying his name wrong in Dayton, is really freaking good and big and versatile. And he had 26 and 10, took 15 free throws and had 3 assists. And I chased and went for St. Louis plus 10.5 live last night, and they cut it to 11. I'm feeling good until Letang gets doubled in the post and rips a behind the back pass to Durkak for an and one. He's tough to deal with, and I think George Washington has the personnel to deal with him better, which is where everything starts, as good as Bennett and some of these other guys on Dayton are. So like them at home, and like you had mentioned to me before, big spot for George Washington to push out of that 8-9 game in the A10 bracket.
Yeah, when I look at GW, if I can lay, let's call it 3.5 or less, I don't mind with the spread. Otherwise, I'm going to use it kind of as a money line sweetener, put into a couple of small parlays. We mentioned, 2-4 without Castro in the lineup. Also, when he was in the lineup, they gave Florida a game. They were within 3 of McNeese in the final 2 minutes. Their overall ceiling goes up considerably when he's out there playing. And I don't have all that much to add other than the fact that I think this is a great situational spot. All the reason in the world for GW to sprint through the tape here to get the best seeding possible in the A10 tournament. All right, let's close things out with our best bets parlay. We're going to bring our 3 best ones to the table. Duck, as always, being sneaky, keeping this one till the final second here. And it's Pepperdine with the buzzer beater. Talk me through the waves and what they're bringing to the table.
Yeah, you want to listen to this podcast all the way through to get the best action from me. We talked last week and with Evan a little bit about Pepperdine and how they have completely changed the mosaic of their team. Pepperdine closes out on Saturday with Washington State. The projected total is 154 and Wazoo's team total is 80, and we're going to go over on both. Not a parlay, but 2 bets that are correlated. I want to not shy away from what we've seen from Ed Sheeling, just completely changing the defensive makeup and just the spirit of how this team is playing. Absolutely zero defense. 9 straight games that Pepperdine has surrendered at least 80 points or more, and 9 straight overs from the Waves. Now we have the two worst defenses in the WCC squaring off. Wazoo has run some more up tempo in recent games, and now they get Tomas Thrasterson back in the mix to complement ND Okafor. These two are going to shred the interior of Pepperdine's defense. For Pepperdine, Styles Phipps and Aaron Clark, they're going to have opportunities to get open looks in this one. Both of these defenses are horrific at defending the arc. Pepperdine is going to play really hard on senior day in the season finale, and travel concerns for Wazoo are mitigated here as they're already in LA playing against Loyola Marymount. They just have to make the short trip up to Malibu, maybe get an extra day of shoot around in that gym. I want the over here at 154 or so, and I want the Wazoo team total over. For anyone listening in, the first number you see, because this is going to steam. We saw the Pepperdine game against Seattle, which is being played on Wednesday. Steam 8 points. You want to get the first number you see.
All right, I'm going to stick with my boys, the Tommies. St. Thomas covering on their home floor against NDSU. Game of the year there. Janowski or Minnesale, I think, is going to go for 25 plus and power that offense past the Bison. All right, Christian, close us out here.
Illinois, they're going to get it done over Michigan. I'm going to be there. I'm excited.
All right, that's it for the Big Bets on Campus podcast. A special thanks to Christian, to Duck, and to Evan Miya for joining us. As always, if you want to throw us a 5-star rating and review, we would love to hear from you. Doesn't matter what you say, just give us that 5-star rating and review. If you're over on the YouTube channel, make sure to subscribe and like, because we have a lot of content that's going to be coming in the next few weeks. You don't want to miss any of it. For YouTube, the Saturday live show, 10:30 a.m. Eastern. And then in terms of our conference tournament previews, don't worry, we're doing every single one of them. Stuckey is doing the Lord's work, coordinating with everyone. You're going to hear from every single person in the BBOC universe. We're going to share the basketball, but at the end of the day, we're going to give you picks who's going to win outright in every single one of those tournaments. So you don't want to miss any of that. Thanks again for listening into the Big Bets on Campus podcast. Best of luck with all your bets, and we'll see you at the window.